Welcome to Living Life with Dr. John Paul James. And we're going to continue the discussion today. I'm Dr. Fabian Tucker, and we're going to continue the discussion of love, life, and relationship. And I have two great co-hosts with me on tonight, none other than Dr. Linda Stutterman Ward and Tamara Clark. Introduce yourself. Say a little bit about yourself. Share a little bit about you, Dr. Linda Stutterman Ward.
All right, blessings on blessings to everyone. I am a graduate with a bachelor's degree in clinical social work and from Bowie State College. It was college back when I came through. I have a master's in clinical social work from Howard University, and I have a PhD in arts and religious studies from Springfield Christian College and Theological Seminary. And I am a Christian counselor for the last 45 years.
And you also have what, Exodus to Hope?
And I have my own private practice of Exodus to Hope.
Explain a little bit about Exodus to Hope as we're going to dive into living with love, life, and relationship. How does Exodus to Hope play a part in helping people understand how to live life, love, and relationships?
So Exodus to Hope is a strength-based, word-driven counseling and training service that provides the word as a foundation to change your perspective on how you develop the skills and capabilities to address mental health disorders.
Okay. Tamara Clark, share a little about you and what you do.
Well, I'm not as knowledgeable as Doctor here.
All right.
I feel a little, but however, my name is Tamara Clark. I am a singer, psalmist, songwriter, actress as well. I'm a mother of three young adults actually.
All right.
One who actually deals with mental health as well, so I'm excited to get some nuggets on the show today. And that's about it.
All right. So we want to deal with life, love, and relationship, but we also want to deal with how mental disorders such as depression and anxiety affects a person from living that life or experiencing love or having a healthy relationship. So when you deal with a mental disorder, it's a characteristic by a clinically significant disturbance in an individual's connotation, emotional regulation, or behavior. It is usually associated with distress or impairment in important areas of functioning. So now we want to understand what anxiety is. Anxiety is a disorder characterized by worry, fear, and anxiety strong enough to interfere with one's daily activity. So we understand now, dealing with anxiety, it will hinder a person from living life to the fullest. Is that not true?
That's true.
What would you have to say about that, Dr. Ward?
Well, I would say that there are 6 systems that mental health impacts, and it's family and education, employment, health and behavioral health, judicial, and religion. Those systems are impacted. And so when COVID hit, which I call the reset, it reset all the systems. And it helped individuals across the board address the barriers of seeking services to address mental health, because they changed the name to behavioral health, which is appropriate because your behavior is an indication of your mental health. And so any of these systems that have been impacted by COVID brought about a lot of attention to people realizing that what coping skills and strategies that were effective are no longer effective. And so they manifested behaviors indicating issues with anxiety and depression. And part of the anxiety that comes about, it is based on fear. It's based on the unknown. And COVID came out with major unknown issues evolving around it. So people had a lot of anxiety around COVID and around the familiar strategies that they use to cope. And so families were impacted in terms of getting together, supporting one another, and we are not built to be alone. God put us here to be interactive with others. And so a lot of isolation brought about depression, brought about anxiety. And so with education, you had to go virtual. And so here we are, isolated again. And so with employment, people lost their jobs because they couldn't go to work. Then you had the overwhelming surge of health issues related to COVID, as well as behavioral health issues, which is why they changed the name to address the poverty that is at the core of most mental health issues, the barrier of stigma, because most cultures of people of color see mental health as a stigma. And the other part of it is the shame that goes along with it. So when you're talking, like if you're having a conversation with a very good friend and you're going through some things, you're struggling, and you're sharing your heart to these individuals who have compassion and empathy. And the first thing that they say to you, well, maybe you need to see somebody, maybe need to talk to someone. The first reaction is defensiveness.
So you say first reaction for most people, especially of color, is to be defensive about someone saying you need some help.
The first thing they're gonna say is, I'm not crazy.
Okay.
But they don't understand that behavioral health is on a spectrum. Just like diabetes, you can be pre-diabetic or you can be diabetic. Mental health, mental wellness, which is what we should be focusing on, is on a spectrum. And so it's 0 to 10. And so if you're having issues coping, it's probably life, probably relationships, and you're on a spectrum of 2 or 3 or 4, because you are managing appropriately, effectively, the challenges that are coming towards you in your life, in your relationships. When you get to 4 and 5, you realize that what you were using that was effective is no longer working for you. So you might have to step outside of yourself and the circle that you have to get some professional help.
So again, you're saying because of what happened with this COVID epidemic, it changed the dynamics of life, love, and relationship as well.
As well as the perspective of people viewing behavioral health. Because it became massive. It became massive in terms of the impact. So anxiety rose, depression rose. And with depression precedes suicide. And suicide is a two-edged coin. One side is suicide, one side is homicide. It's the same coin, except that suicide, you internalize that anger, that hopelessness, that worthlessness. The flip side of homicide is that you present it and you put it outward. So that's why we had mass shootings in parking lots and in stores. There was no reason. You could not make sense out of foolishness. But it had its core in the inability of people to manage their emotions of fear, hopelessness, helplessness, and worthlessness, because they were no longer feeling that they had a control over their lives. And so out of the depression and the suicide and the homicide, we see that still now. And what we see is we see a lot of teens, males, with the access to guns. With suicide in America, men are 4 times more likely to commit suicide because they have access to guns. Women are more accessible to go and seek help and talk out. So they're less likely to commit suicide. But the suicide and the homicide are the same coin, just on different sides. One is external, one is internal.
Okay. What do you have to say about that, Tamara?
Well, just picking up a few things from what I've experienced with one of my children having mental issues. It definitely, one of the questions I wanted to pose was the core of, I want to say anxiety or depression. I was wondering if there's something that may have happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
Traumatic to them, and they suppress it, okay? And then because they never really dealt with it, they suppress it. And when certain things happen, certain triggers happen, then that's when the anxiety and the depression starts to surface. And then they, go into episodes and things like that. So I kind of understand what you're saying when it comes to the external and the internal. Because as I watched the transition, it was more so internal for them.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I would say pertaining to that is that because mental illness seems to be kind of swept under the carpet a little bit.
That's the stigma.
We as parents, especially those with children that have those, it's like, you don't know what to do. Like, they're in a full-blown episode, and it's like, how? And then as a mother, I try to learn and understand what they're going through, where some parents are just like, oh, he tripping, oh, this, that, and that. But I'm like, no, I believe that there's something really to the core, really something traumatic that caused them to really act out and have that anxiety and that depression. They don't know how to cope, or they don't know how to talk to someone to release whatever it is that they're dealing with.
So, Dr. Ward, as we're having this discussion, you just heard the concerns of Tamara. How would you enlighten parents of how to deal with children that's dealing with depression and anxiety?
All right, so first of all, anxiety has its basis in fear. Fear is the core of anxiety, and fear perpetuates stress. And stress, when you perseverate in stress, you develop anxiety. Depression is separate from anxiety because depression has its cause in a chemical imbalance,
Right.
which is why you have pharmaceuticals.
Right.
Okay, so depression is the chemical imbalance. There are situations that can cause anxiety. For example, we could take just being able to pay your rent. That can cause much anxiety because you're fearful of homelessness.
Yes.
You're fearful of losing all of whatever you have gained as your possessions. There is a shame to that. There's
Okay.
a stigma to that. We don't call it, we're trying to clean up the stigmas, so we don't call mental health, we call it behavior health. We
Okay.
don't call homelessness homeless anymore. We call it, to take the stigma away, unhoused.
Okay.
It's still the same
Absolutely.
issue.
Absolutely.
You have to understand it's still the same issue, but it makes it more palatable for people to accept
Accept it.
because
Yeah.
there's stigmas with homelessness. There's stigmas and shame with having a mental health disorder. It is just like everyone has someone in their family who abuses alcohol.
Okay.
And they have a family reunion, and we know that everybody who knows Uncle Joe is
All
going
right.
to come and is going to have behaviors that are indicative of him abusing alcohol. You tolerate it to a point.
So again, so you're
Tolerate.
saying
Good
even
word.
with the alcohol, they're trying to mask the anxiety or fear or other.
Because alcohol and drugs
Okay.
are depressant. You are double binding yourself when you self-medicate with depression and you're depressed. There's a difference between sadness
Okay.
and depression.
Explain it,
Depression,
hold up one second. You're doing a phenomenal job. Explain a little bit the difference between sadness and depression.
so sadness is an emotion that you may experience based on a situation.
Okay.
Depression lasts for years. It's a chemical imbalance that lasts for years. Even with pharmaceutical intervention, there has to be a focus of using skills and capabilities that you know work, because a lot of the things that you have to do in changing your perspective deals with you being able to identify the cognitive distortions that you're believing.
Okay, so let's watch this. How can you give some of the audience understanding or how to perceive when someone is dealing with depression or anxiety? They could be husband and wife or father and children, mother and father with children. But how can because again, if anxiety and depression is affecting families, how can we help families identify, and then what can we release to them to be able to help their families come, or their members of their families come out of depression or anxiety?
Okay, so anxiety has symptoms. The DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that every medical and behavioral health practitioner uses, because they have gone through research and data to come up with symptomatology that you can base your diagnosis on and know that it's accurate. So when someone has anxiety, they feel nervous, they're restless, they're tense, they have a sense of impending danger, panic or doom. They have increased heart rate, because this is what your body is experiencing. You go through hyperventilation because you start breathing rapidly. You start sweating and trembling. You start feeling weak and tired because your body is trying to manage these emotions. You have trouble concentrating or thinking about anything else but what is present as your worry. You feel wound up and on edge. You are easily fatigued because your body is trying to manage those emotions. You have difficulty concentrating, you're irritable, and it manifests in headaches, muscle aches, stomach aches, and pains that you can't even explain.
Okay.
Okay? You have difficulty controlling your feelings of worry, and you have sleep problems. Now, you have sleep problems when you're depressed because you won't sleep all the time. But anxiety, you're using sleep as your distraction of what you feel with this anxiety. So you have problems staying asleep or falling asleep. Wow. The PTSD.
So now let me ask
Okay.
hold on a second. Now, Tamara, now that you heard some of the symptoms, as you say you dealt with a family member that was dealing with depression, did you see any of these signs in the time that you were observing?
Oh, for sure. And then I've seen them in myself a few times.
Okay.
No, because I was sitting there, because, like, for example, I want to give an example. And I just realized that I believe that I have anxiety. So sometimes when I'm asked out to go out and sing, especially if it's a place I've never been before, whatever, when I'm getting myself together, I am so nervous. I'm shaking. I have difficulty concentrating on what it is I'm trying to get, what I'm doing to get myself together. Sometimes I break out in a sweat, and I was like, is this anxiety?
It's anxiety.
That I'm
it is
feeling?
anxiety.
And I'm like, wow, so.
But it's different when you experience anxiety based on a situation or event. When you have anxiety disorder, it's all the time.
Okay, I don't have
It's
those.
all, we all experience anxiety.
Okay.
We all experience anxiety.
That's so true.
Like I said, mental health, behavioral health is on a spectrum. You were 2 or 3 or 4 in your event.
If I can share this with just one more event.
Go
So,
ahead.
I had COVID. I caught COVID in March of 21, whatever. So I had the symptoms, the slow talking, et cetera, et cetera. So I called my mom, and my mom was like, go to the hospital. So mind you, of course, during that time, when folks was going to the hospital, they wasn't coming home, right? So I was like,
That's right.
but because my talking, I was like really like sick. And this is the first time it ever happened to me. I got up and my mom said, get dressed, call the ambulance. So I called the ambulance, And they were on the way to come get me, so I'm trying to get myself together, you know, at least get something, some clothes on. When I say, I literally start hyperventilating.
Okay.
Like, I've never experienced that. But I started hyperventilating because, as you said before, fear, and then your perspective of what we hear going on with COVID. So my fear was like, I'm not coming back out of the hospital. I don't know if, I'm gonna make it. So I heard someone say when they have that type of anxiety to count 100 backwards. So that did help.
To concentrate and take your mind
Yes.
off of the emotions that you are feeling.
But I was like, like literally.
Right.
So at that one time, you was experiencing both anxiety and depression because of the fact that you had caught COVID, right?
I don't know if it's depression, but nobody wants COVID.
That's what I'm
but-
saying. I know, but that's what I say. That would bring forth the manifestation of depression because I would never expect this to happen to me.
True. I couldn't believe it, but yeah.
Yeah, well, reality testing. Reality testing. But I think that your example of catching COVID and the worry,
Yes.
the fear,
Yes.
the stress,
Yes.
and all the unknowns, because fear comes from the unknown, perpetuated you experiencing those physiological symptoms of anxiety. So with depression, it lasts for years. It's a chemical imbalance. And depression can also come from illnesses. Like if you are on dialysis and your life is now connected to a machine every other day. And so you lose your independence. You lose your confidence. Your body is definitely changing how it used to look. You don't have the energy to do what you used to do. Therefore, you become depressed. Seniors who retire and they lose their mates and they lose their comrades based on age-related illnesses, they become depressed because they're isolated. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a anxiety disorder based on a traumatic event.
So we say COVID is a traumatic event
Yes, it
that's
is.
costing, because most associated post-traumatic stress disorders with being in the military, dealing with wars and everything else,
Right.
and
Absolutely.
then coming back home and then not being able to cope.
Because when you have post-traumatic stress disorder, your body has been in a self-preservative state. It's about self-preservation. And you're always on.
So you say you're always on high alert.
You're
Listen,
always on high
you're
alert.
always on high alert.
Okay, so it doesn't just apply to people who have been to war.
Okay.
It applies to the communities that keep on witnessing teenage violence and murders.
Okay.
That's PTSD in the community. But each person's response to the event is different. So if you witness, for example, the young man who was killed at 13 years old, breaking into cars, a neighbor shot and killed him. He's a DC employee. Mayor Bowser put him on administrative leave.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So, what would this individual feel when he realizes he took a life of a 13-year-old over something that's material? It's the right thing to do because you're protecting your property, but it has magnanimous consequences because of the act. So you have a family who is now without their son. You have a working individual who's providing for his family that now has to deal with the fact that he killed somebody, murdered somebody.
Okay.
So he is going to have PTSD because it's a traumatic event. And whenever he sees some youngins in the neighborhood messing with cars, he's gonna relive that because it triggers that. And the people who are in those communities that witness the murders constantly of young teens, they don't become anesthetized. They become hypervigilant because of what is going on in their community.
Explain
when
hypervigilance, when you're talking about hypervigilance, explain that a little bit for us.
you're on, you're on, you're
Okay.
hyped, you're up here, all the
Okay.
way, you're all the way live.
Yes.
That's
So
that's what I wanted you to break it down and say.
Going
yo,
all the way
absolutely.
live. So when you hear a backfire of a car, for people who have been in the community and have heard gunshots,
Okay,
they're gonna hit the floor in their house.
that's their natural
That's
response.
their natural response.
Absolutely.
Self-preservation. They're not going out to see what's happening outside their door. So that's the PTSD, the anxiety derivative of PTSD. PTSD is a derivative of anxiety. So with depression, the symptoms of depression is that you don't have any joy of anything that used to bring you excitement and joy and satisfaction. You don't have that. You have decreased appetite. You have insomnia. You can't sleep or you're sleeping all the time. You have decreased appetite. Not overeating, you have decreased appetite. When I say you don't overeat, it's because in anxiety, you might self-medicate with some food. You might self-medicate with some alcohol. You might self-medicate with some drugs. Or you might go shopping online. It's real easy now.
Oh, right.
You can buy whatever you like. However, you don't anticipate the cost. You haven't thought about what the cost is because you have to pay for that. But if you're not working because COVID took your job, how you gonna pay for it? Another stress level. So it's a complex situation when you talk about behavioral health because every individual experiences the disorders differently. But there's a commonality, which is that you can't function like you used to. And you need some help to be able to get back. And so when I was talking about the spectrum of 1 to 10, when you start realizing that what you used to do is no longer working, you have to get over the fact of the shame that you're not competent anymore.
Okay.
Okay, because you start feeling incompetent,
Yeah,
that you
absolutely.
can't do what you used to do in solving these problems. You have to get over the stigma of going to talk to someone. Because, like I said, in cultures of color, even in the islands, it's taboo. It is taboo. You don't take your stuff out of the house. Most people remember your parents saying, what goes on in the house stays in the house.
Okay.
And so that perpetuates that barrier to get the help that you need because early intervention will bring about early recovery.
So that's so powerful. What do you have to share? Tamara.
As you were talking, Doctor, it's interesting because what popped up in my mind was here's one thing. Can people experience post-traumatic stress disorder in relationships? Meaning, if they previously experienced domestic violence and something happens and argument and then that PTSD just happens to resurface. That was one
That's
thing.
a trigger.
And that's what I was going to say.
It's a trigger.
It's a trigger because
It's a trigger.
it brings you back to the past.
Right.
And your body responds to that.
Absolutely.
And you are up here
Yeah.
because you want to survive.
Yes.
It's self-protection.
Yeah.
It is the survival
Mechanism.
mechanism, thank you, mechanism that is within you.
So, and I say that because I thought about a situation, dealing with one of my children, and I didn't know this because I'm a victim of domestic violence. And he used to wish he was Superman when he would see me go through what I was going through. And I remember he talked to a therapist or whatever, and she said he wished he was Superman so he could save me.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I wonder if that plays a part in why they have the mental illness or mental issues that they have because of what they saw growing up pertaining to what I had to deal with. Then also too, I noticed when I find myself talking to someone or, you know, trying to build a relationship, and it can be just something they say, you know, or, you know, and I just be like, hold up, like my whole body just, I don't know, it's like this tingling feeling, and I'm like, oh no, I can't do this, you know what I'm saying? Like, because, you know, all of that stuff, I'm like, I guess it's a trigger, you know what I'm
It's
saying?
called a trigger. It's
Mhm.
called a trigger.
It's a trigger for
So,
me.
okay, so you said that you are victorious over domestic violence.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
You
Yes.
are not a victim. You are victorious.
Yes.
You are an overcomer.
Amen.
All right. However, I want you to hear what I'm about to say.
Okay.
In domestic violence situations and relationships, it takes an individual 7 times to actually leave that toxic relationship.
We'll never
So
learn.
hold on, say that again. It takes some. how-
7 times to leave that toxic relationship. And the reason is twofold. One, you are fearful that you're gonna die
Okay.
because they have threatened you with death.
Yes.
And you have been assaulted enough to know the physical pain to know that that is not a joke.
It is possible.
It is very possible.
Okay.
Okay. The second reason why it's hard for individuals to leave a toxic relationship is that there is a trauma bond.
Wow. So, a trauma bond?
A trauma bond. There's a bond.
Please,
There's a bond.
Please explain, Dr. Ward. Please explain what a trauma bond is to those that are watching.
There is a bond that develops between two individuals, even though it's dysfunctional and even though it's toxic. The relationship promotes the bond in a dysfunctional way. So there's a trauma bond between the assailant and the partner.
Okay.
And that trauma bond, even though it's dysfunctional and distorted, can keep the person in that relationship. It only is broken, or rather fractured.
So then hold on one
Okay.
second. So when you hear certain trigger points, does that take you back, as she's explaining, to the trauma bond of that former relationship?
So I was thinking, I can't say that it was trauma bond for me. I think it was more like what we talked about in another relationship. It was like a love bombing situation.
A what?
Love bombing. Like he would shower me with gifts. He would, you know, I mean, everything. He buy me roses, give me gifts, took me out, did things for me no one has ever done before.
Okay.
I'm trying to, as you're talking, I was trying to figure out where it could have been where we experienced the trauma bonding. And I can't see.
Okay, so there's a cycle of abuse.
Yeah.
Okay, and that cycle of abuse is what you just mentioned, that he would buy you things, that he would shower you with things, that would give you all the attention that you need, because he knows you better than you know yourself, because that's what they do. They take the time to assess you. And so when they act out and they abuse you, they never take responsibility. Well, if you had done this, you had done that, blah, 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 right? Taking no responsibility.
It looks like you tapped into something.
Okay, well, it's called
Did she tap into
domestic
it? Did she tap into something
Oh,
today?
definitely.
Right?
Okay.
Okay. And so, because they know you well, they will play into what will you respond to get you to forgive them superficially. Because you're in the moment.
Yeah.
You're trying to be healed.
Uh-huh.
And you have hope. You have hope because you love this guy.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Trauma bond. Okay.
So now you got your trauma bond.
Okay, I got it.
Okay.
You have an understanding of what kept you in the relationship.
Yes.
A lot of women who are in and I'm telling you now, Domestic violence is not just male and female.
Right.
It's female, female, it's male, male. Violence has no gender.
That's right.
That's
right.
So, but what I do find is that the trauma bond and the final straw that propels the individual who is being assaulted won't do it primarily for themselves. The kids are the ones that will perpetuate them to reassess their
Okay.
life.
You
They
are so
reassess
right.
their lives because they don't want, it's that maternal instinct
Yes.
to protect your children. And so you will, mothers will put
hold
them
on. So just like she said, her son wanted to be Superman.
to
That
protect her.
they had
Right.
the woman or whoever is being abused. They now rise up not because of their own worth or self-worth or how they perceive themselves, but they're looking at what the effect it can have on their family. So again, it's dealing with love, life,
Right.
and
And
relationships,
Right.
anxiety and fear and everything else that goes along with it that brings these types of situations to the forefront. Because even dealing with, like you say, this pandemic, you see all this abuse coming because again, fear of not being able to provide for families.
Right.
Fear of not really being able to communicate because we've been so busy building a so-called look of success,
Right.
of what success looks like to the world with life, love, and relationships. But when all the extra or the exterior is no longer in play, now we got to revert back to the eternal and deal with ourselves and really be true to who our real identity is
Yes.
and function and see if we can function or rebuild ourselves and our families in love, life, and relationship.
So when I was talking about the 6 systems, and I stopped at health and behavioral health,
Okay.
the judicial system was impacted by COVID because they discharged, they released non-violent offenders
Okay.
because of the fear of contagion.
That's true.
That was a whole reset for the judicial system. And for the system of religion, the churches were shut down. You couldn't go to church, the buildings were shut down. So COVID reset a lot of the systems, some, well really most, to the benefit of each system, to show where the vulnerabilities were and where you needed to focus to be able to bring strength and healing to each system. So when you talk about domestic violence and COVID, it was a surge.
It was.
It was a surge with domestic violence. It was a surge with child abuse
Yes.
because people were angry. But they were angry because they had no sense of control. What was familiar was no longer familiar. So they felt incompetent.
Okay.
They felt a lack of confidence. They had lack of self-esteem, which is why we talked about the suicide and the homicide being the same coin, just different sides. So when we talk about depression, depression will precede suicide and homicide. Anxiety will not. Anxiety does not promote suicide. It does not. Depression does. And the
Okay.
difference is that your anxiety is about fear
Okay.
and you having control over your life. Depression is the onset of despair. Despair, meaning that you are so overwhelmed with life
There's
that
no hope.
you have no hope.
Okay.
And I want to make it clear that individuals who complete suicide, they don't want to die. They don't want to die.
No, they don't.
They just want the pain
Pain to stop.
to stop.
Okay.
So if you've ever had a really bad toothache, magnify that 1,000 times with the emotional weight, because you think that, well, they had family that they loved them and they didn't think about what the impact was going to be with their family. No, because they are in such psychological pain, you can't describe it. They just want relief.
Wow. Absolutely. And so that's so important. So this platform of Dr. John Paul James is so needed for such a time as this, as well as the information that he's providing on this podcast. Even with having y'all on tonight, it's been phenomenal to help empower people to understand the magnitude of choices, because everything is a choice.
Right?
So we must make right choices, but we also need the help to, like you say, to bring information in to expose where the issues lie so they can become healthy to live the life that they truly desire.
So there's 2 points that I want to make. Recently on the news, well, let me say this. Individuals who watch the news, you should be watching for information. When you listen to the news over and over and over again, that is not information seeking, that is saturation. So
Okay.
what are you putting into your spirit, right? Because the news is nothing but negativity. So you are taking all that negativity into your spirit. So if you are watching the news constantly, please change your actions for your own behavioral health. That's one.
Because most of what you're gonna news is negative.
That's
so
it. It's
okay.
all. It's all
Okay.
names. Okay.
Go ahead.
The second piece is that I wanted to share is that recently on the news there was a story that a husband came home, murdered his wife and 4 kids after being served papers for divorce.
Yeah, I heard
You heard
that.
that?
Okay.
Yeah.
His life as he knew it was going to be different. And he was fearful of that. And because when he saw that his life was going to be different and it wouldn't be familiar, what was his role going to be? For a man, you know, you're supposed to be strong. That's what society says. You're supposed to be strong. You can't be weak in the military, which is why there's such a strong push for mental health to be accepted in the military. Because no other soldier wants you to be weak because you may not have his back in battle.
Okay.
So when you're talking about him responding in this manner, what he did was he took his anger and put it outside of himself. It was external. He was angry at this wife and the fact that his whole life was going to be different. So he was so angry that he took them out and then he took himself out. And that is prevalent in America now with homicides and suicides because people have lost hope. And what the church needs to do is to get back into teaching who they are in their identity that God calls them to be, which you had started off saying that if you're a parent, that's your assignment. You got a list of tasks and responsibilities. But your identity is Christ, is who he called you to be. You are victorious. You are an overcomer. You are the head and not the tail. He made you in his image and likeness. The kingdom is voice activated. And so when he said in John, Father, make them one with us as we are one, right? Then we have the same power in words. And that's really important for people to understand that your words have power. When I was working in foster care, and I would have mothers who had sons that looked just like the father, and they weren't in the house with the father, and they were really angry at the father, and let the little boy misbehave. You're just like your father. You're not going to be any good. What are you speaking over this child? What are you speaking in your life when you are faced with a challenge? Are you speaking what God says, that you can do all things through Christ? Or are you speaking out of what you see and not what you know? Because what you know is your faith. What you see is what Satan is bringing as a weapon. And the word says he's going to bring the weapon 24/7, kill, steal, and destroy. However, God said it won't prosper. So what are you believing? And who are you believing? And if you believe that it won't prosper, then you already know, based on the history, he's going to turn it around anyway for your good. So you got to have some hope. And we need as a church, and we need as individuals to evangelize your testimony, because people's faith is raised by our testimonies. And you don't have to know book, you don't have to know scripture, you don't have to know chapter. The woman at the well didn't know none of that. She said, come see a man that knew about me. So if he be lifted up, he will draw all men to him.
Amen.
So what I'm saying is that we as individuals have a responsibility to know what we're dealing with educationally, psychoeducationally, but we also need to know that we are empowered to make a difference.
That's powerful. Any last words, Tamara?
Thank you.
You are.
Another thing I wanted to bring out,
Okay.
in terms of, within the church community, mental health and mental illness within the church. I know, from what I understand, or from what I see, it's like, that she said, it's a stigma. And sometimes it concerns me because there are people that they believe God, they trust God, and all that good stuff, but then they still have these mental illnesses. They still don't know how to cope. They still don't know how to, deal with certain things. And I just wanted to get your perspective on mental illness in the church community. What is your perspective on it?
So my perspective is that too long the church has said, just God. They said, just God. God can do all things.
But God, yeah.
However, God put people in the earth to get his work done for healing, for the manifestation. And so it is a joint venture that you have mental health professionals, you have medical professionals, and there's no stigma for a minister or someone in the clergy to refer someone to a medical professional. What is it that keeps us?
But as you're sharing that, here's the biggest issue, as we were talking a little earlier. It still comes down to truly understanding who you are. Not based on what someone else says. It's like you were sharing that you're just like your father, you're just like your mother, because we understand. We grew up back in the day, they said sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you.
That's a lie from the pits of hell.
But the words are the most powerful tool in the earth.
Right.
So that's why the Bible says life and death is where? In the power of the tongue. And you eat the fruit thereof. So when you really don't know who you are, you cannot function in the full capacity as she was saying, as who God says you are. So you using your gift. Most people, we all are gifted. So we all have been given gifts. So we use our gifts and identify ourselves with our giftings. And so when we're not using our gifts to get what we need from someone else or from the people or from the world, then we go into a place of oppression, depression, and everything else, because we can't function. But when you know who you are, it doesn't matter. Just like, I'll give you an example. Apostle Paul said, I learned how to be I'm learning how to be content no matter what state I'm in. So no matter what state you're in, just like dealing with this pandemic, as believers, as true believers, we're supposed to be the example, as Dr. Ward was saying, of letting the world see what true life and living according to what the Word of God says, that we can produce that love, life, and relationship in families and our own personal life, because as we were saying, we are the witnesses. We're the witnesses. Our life is our testimony. How you're living. So again, how are you living? Are you living life to the fullness of who you really are? Or are you still buying into the lies of what the world says, even dealing with a pandemic that's saying you're no longer in control? You're still in control.
You've always been in control.
Always been in
because
control.
God is in control.
Absolutely.
And the full Godhead resides in you.
But if you don't know that,
Don't know it.
because we've been used to going to church,
Right.
but not really building a relationship. The whole thing about living life to the fullness, living life, family, and relationship comes from first having your own personal relationship with God the Father, as she was saying, God the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so we must go back, this reset, as she was saying, we go back to a familiar place, the beginning, and start afresh with fresh understanding of how to become who we really are.
And I think it's not just knowing who you are, but owning and accepting your truth, of your truth, what it is that you dealt with, what it is, how you feel. I know it took me a minute to accept my truth on certain things. And we tend to, I just find like, we just, like you said, we operate on the gift that we have and the titles that people give us. But deep down inside, when we away from the people with the titles and we away from people with the gifts and we sitting by ourselves,
That's right.
our truth really sets in. And a lot of people, they don't really deal with their truth, with their true thoughts, their true feelings in relationships, in life period. And I think sometimes that's why depression sits in, anxiety sits in, because sometimes they can't be their true self in the community that they know, because they're not owning the truth.
Well, a lot of people don't want to own the truth because it's too painful. If they understood that whatever they've gone through is their rehearsal for the next stage that God is taking them to, then they would be able to see how He has orchestrated their steps. You are still here. You was in domestic violence, but you still here. You have knowledge, you have wisdom, you have confidence, and you have compassion and empathy for someone else who has walked that road. So you provide them encouragement. You provide them strength. You provide them love. You give them the mirror of the miracle that you are.
Yes.
And so your truth is your rehearsal for your next phase of what God has got planned for you in your life. He has a purpose and a plan for you. You had to go through that to become all that you have become. When you sing from a place that you feel. And when you're speaking about that event that changed your life, changed you, strengthened you, taught you who you are, taught you are more than enough in who God made you, then you walk differently and you talk differently and you impact other people differently. And so life, love, and relationships
Right.
are all tied together in our interactions with others. And if you're using distractions, gifts, callings, whatever, to keep from dealing with the true you, guess what? Sooner or later, it's going to show up.
Yes, it will.
All right. Well, I would like to thank you, Dr. Linda Sturtevant Ward and Tamara Clark, for being with me right here tonight on Living Life with Dr. John Paul James. Thank you so very much.
Amen.
You talking about yourself.
I said, I brought the ring with me.